Dear old Dad, dear old Dad, was all she could find breath to say. Crummy awake? He asked as soon as he let her go. Not yet, she replied, smiling into his burning eyes. I've come down to let her tray ready, and then I'll wake her and we'll have our cup of tea before she gets up. She wants me to come to the early service at St. John's with her. Early service? Crummy? Murmured Mr. Garrad in astonishment. She's taken a fancy to the church, Dad, ever since you came back from Northwold. Oh dear, I doubt it's either of your daughters will ever get married. You and Mother aren't any good at matchmaking, Dad. Well, 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 muttered Mr. Garrad with a heavy sigh. But as Cody guessed shrewdly enough, it was not the virginity of his children that was worrying him. Her surmise was justified by his next word. Well, well, you'll have the wine and the bread. You'll have Christ's blood in his body. They'll give it to you, of course, in those silly little biscuits that I don't look like bread at all. But it'll be the Master's body, and that's a cheap thing. He stopped and sighed heavily again. Oh, Cordy, my child, he groaned. While a film like that, which would cover the eyes of a dog that saw his master being executed, crossed the irises of his dark eyes. There aren't many Christians who feel him besides them, and yet he's nearer us now than we are to each other. Yes, Dad, dear, murmured Cordy. She always felt extremely embarrassed when her father spoke in this way. The peculiar weight and mass of the man's mystical realism confused and disturbed her. Her own vein of spirituality, or whatever it was invariably associated with aspects of life that were imaginative or at least intellectual. Mr. Garrett's gross and staggering actuality in these things not only disconcerted her, but, to confess the truth, a little disgusted her. It was entirely not in those mystical moods of his that she felt more drawn to her father. That happened when she heard him issuing tactical instructions like some great strategic general to John Crow, or when she heard him disputing with Owen Evans on some debatable point in Glastonbury mythology. Mr. Garrad followed her into the kitchen now, and sitting down upon one of the extremely hard chairs there, Cordy's mother was not one for pampering a wench like Sally Jones, he continued to embarrass her while she lit the fire in the stove and began preparing the thin bread and butter by talking about Christ. He is with us, of course, all the time, Bloody Johnny said. While the physical accident at the singular evangelist was interrupted now and again by a hiccough, increased his daughter's distaste. But today he is with us most powerfully. Much more powerfully than any other day in the year. More powerfully, Dad? I don't quite understand, protested Cordelia. And having poured quite a lot of water out of the kettle, in order to accelerate the boiling, she began spreading the butter upon the oblong, square-edged tin loaf of a different appearance, altogether from the one which the master of the house had just ravaged. As he watched her quick, competent movements, Mr. Garrad thought to himself, Muhammad easily converted his wife to his prophesizing. Did he have just the same trouble as I have with a daughter? Somehow the cutting of the practical tin loaf, with its deep edges and uninteresting crust, brought down the ecstasy of Bloody Johnny more effectively than almost anything else could have done. The mayor of Glastonbury felt at the moment as if he were disturbing the work, not of a mere daughter, but of all the competent executives in the world. I mean by mere powerful, Cordy, he went on, the film over his eyes growing thicker and thicker as the kettle began to simmer, that he has more direct power over matter today than on ordinary days. He's always ready to work miracles if you call on him strongly enough. But today, when he broke loose, he can change everything if you and I only make a sign. Getting up from his seat and moving across the room, to his daughter's dismay, Mr. Garrad opened the kitchen door and looked out to the westward. As he turned his face towards this quarter where, beyond the terraces of tradesmen's houses, A milk cart was standing in front of Otherly's dairy. You could see high up in the air a great flock of starlings, tossed up and down in discordant broken masses, and darkly outlined against the driving grey clouds. "Do shut the door, Dad," cried Cordelia crossly. "You can either come in or go out." Mr. Garrad came in and closed the door with extreme gentleness. He did not say to himself, "How careless of me not to think of the poor girl being in her dressing gown." He said to himself, "She must have an instinct that this fellow Evans told me he was engaged for dinner today. Engaged for dinner. Or at least, at any rate, couldn't come. Poor little girl, it's a shame. The only man she's ever had. A madman like that. With God knows what on his consciousness. Possibly a murder." But the tea was made now, the bread and butter cut, and the tray ready to be carried upstairs. "I've put out 4 cups," said Cordelia, "for I thought I'd get Crummy up and we'd come into Mother's room. Mother loves a cup of tea in bed and never lets herself have one." It must be confessed that neither of the girls expressed any great disappointment when they heard of the absence of their father from today's midday meal. Cordelia still entertained a hope that Owen Evans was coming. Crummy knew that Red Robinson was not coming, but that, on the contrary, Mr. Birder, who had spoken to her on the street yesterday, had said he might call in an early afternoon. Since Mr. Garrad had spoken severely to Mr. Robinson on the subject of his officious activity with regard to the Morgan woman, there had been a definite estrangement between Red and Crummy, which Crummy's mood, when she met him after the choir supper, had not helped to remove. No, the girls were not sorry to hear of their father's visit to Lord P. His presence was always a restraint on these occasions, and not infrequently a positive embarrassment. So that in their hearts both daughters felt a thrill of gratitude to the Marquis for his eccentric partiality. It was always a puzzle to both of them when the secret was of their father's success when he went out into the great world. And this particular interest in his personality displayed by Lord P was a complete mystery to them. He said in his letter that there was no one with him at Markmoor but Rachel, announced Mr. Garrad. The 3 women faces lit up at this piece of news. Hitherto they had displayed only the faintest interest in his excursions. But the mention of Rachel brought down on Mr. Garrad's head a volley of questions. How old was she? Why was she at Markmoor? Was it true that she was very fragile and almost an invalid? Wasn't Markmoor Court a rough-and-tumble kind of place for a delicately nurtured young girl to stay in? Did Lord P bring any servants with him? What did Lady Rachel do with her time when her father was out shooting? Now, I believe Rachel is the one who was having an affair with that poet I read stuff that John Crow hired to write the script to the Easter thing or whenever they're going to have it. Chuckling over these questions as he lurched heavily out of the room and down the stairs, Mr. Garrad was soon making his way with an old faded semi-ecclesiastical ulster that had once belonged to Canon Crow thrown over his black clothes towards the Pilgrim's Inn. I'll go leisurely, he thought to himself. Lord P won't be at church anyway, that's certain. But if he can't see me till noon, I'll look about a bit over there. Mr. Garrad was indeed successful beyond his own private expectations, which were a good deal less optimistic than he had allowed his family to suspect, in his quest for a quiet street that day. His Ulster friend supplied him with an old roan mare, who had been a famous hunter in her time and was still a very handsome creature. Wouldn't trust her, avowed the man, winking, with anyone but your worship. But as do all know, What a firm hand you have with the females, old and young. And Daisy Queen's got the intellect of a bitch dog. With his canonical ulster buttoned tight under his chin and a heavy riding crop, lent him by his ex-converted tight, clutched in his ungloved fingers, Bloody Johnny, mounted upon Daisy Queen, took the road for Marquart. The wind came from the southeast and he was riding almost due northwest. Directly in front of him, about 10 miles away, he could see the strangely shaped protuberance of Brent Knoll, drowsing there in the midst of the level fens like a great sleepy amphibian whose skin was too tough. There's a little space between the two and Uggs, so it looks like too Ugg, but it's tough. Too tough and slippery to feel the rush of the wind that was now careening like a host of demons of the reedy expanse. The only drawback to Mr. Garrad's immense feelings of liberation was the flapping of his ulster, which the wind, blowing violently behind his back, kept lifting up and whirling about his ears. But he rode on to a steady pace, every now and then rubbing the thick handle of his crop against his horse's neck as he leaned forward in the saddle, and murmuring her name with chuckling endearments, such as, "That's the time of day, Daisy Queen. Best lass in the stables thee be, Daisy Queen. Clean straw and a peck of oats, Daisy, when old John and thee get safe to King Mark's lodge." The mad rush of the southeast wind, whistling past the rider's head, lifting the mare's mane and tail and causing her to turn her ears now and again, as if she were listening to invisible and ghostly hoofbeats behind her, gave to the green spring landscape across which they trotted, horse and man, in this turmoil of the elements, grown as close as if they had been one creature, a curiously phantasmal appearance. Groups of poplars blowing themselves westward were so blown down by the wind that the normal flutterings of their thin-stalked leaves were taken up and absorbed in one long, wild straining, as if each leaf were trying to escape from the burden of clinging any more to its parent twig, and as if the whole soul of the tree were trying to escape from its rooted posture and float away over the dikes and ditches till it lost itself in the Bristol Channel. The green, thickly grown tops of the pollards, as they too were blown westward, became the wild heads of armies of girl-twitches, while great beds of reeds, where the young shoots were mingled with tall dead stalks and brown feathery husks, set up, as the wind swept through them, an accumulated shivering cry, a cry like the cry of the cranes of Ibis, that ran from weir to weir, from gate to gate, from dike to dike, and kept gathering strength as it ran. It was hard to restrain Daisy Queen from breaking into a gallop as the shrieking demon drove there faster and faster towards Markmoor. But the man and the horse had now become, for Bloody Johnny, in spite of his weight, had the true instincting of a rider, enough of one solid unit on the crest of this raving wave to enable the man's desire not to shorten the ride by any such speed to be strong enough to rule the occasion. Thus it was nearly 11 o'clock, about the time when the 5 minutes bell in the tower of all the Somerset churches from the Quantocks to the Mendipes was calling the loiters in porch and purlieu to enter the building and take their places, when Garrad rode into the long avenue of sycamores that laid up the steep slope to the eastern entrance of Marquart. The old trees were groaning in the great wind as he rode up the slope, and in several places Daisy Queen had to veer aside to avoid fallen branches. The greenness of these broken boughs, as Garrad pulled up to walk his mare past them, had a livedness in the great light that struck him as startling and unusual. It was extraordinary how the green light between these massive trunks responded to the wind. It seemed itself to be in the process of flying through the air, along with ragged winged rocks and hoarsely crying jackdaws. Before he caught sight of the grey walls of Marquart itself, hidden round the third curve of the leafy ascent, he heard a series of shrill, discordant screams from somewhere in front of him The crying, as he well knew from his old experience at Montacute, of peacocks wildly excited by the wind. Queer that he should keep them out here, he thought to himself. They swung round a bend of the drive now, the mare panting a little from the steepness of the way, and from the weight of the man on her back. Then, all suddenly, she plunged and swerved to the right of the path. There's a high, dark bank just here, out of which the polished roots of some tall, white-trunked beeches stretched forth, patched with clumps of emerald green moss. It was perhaps well that Daisy Queen was somewhat spent. It certainly was well that her hasty shying brought her bolt up against the clay slope of the steep bank. Twisting his body round to see what had frightened the mare, Mr. Garrad became conscious of the slight figure of a bare-headed young girl, watching him with excitement, brown eyes, and a faint smile of nervous concern. As soon as he got his horse under control again and was safely back on the level path quite close to where she stood, he took off his battered felt hat with a sweeping bow. The girl was the sort of figure that a visitor might expect to come upon in a glade at Fontainebleau or Bayeux or Chantilly. Mr. Garrad had never been out of his native land, but it was with the sort of historic glamour that those names summon up that he had once surrounded this frail apparition. And who that apparition is, spoiler alert, it's Lady Rachel, but we'll find again tomorrow. Again? We'll find out tomorrow. Although I just told him. Yeah, goodbye.